So in that case, without more ado, I will shut up now and I will hand over to Gemma Symonds.
Okay, Simon, thank you very much. And thank you very much, all of you who are willing to spend part of this evening listening to me. I know that time is relatively short, and therefore I'd like to get cracking on. And I do want very much to pick up one aspect of what Simon spoke about, which was the death of my very dear friend and colleague, Philip Endine. Philip was not only a very old friend and a companion throughout my religious life, but he was the most extraordinarily generous and effective companion to my congregation in our many years of general congregations, chapter meetings, the like. And he will be a great loss to us, to my particular part of the Ignatian religious family. But I think of him also as somebody from whom I learned an enormous amount about Ignatian discernment and the whole Ignatian spirit. And therefore, what I want to present to you tonight is something that gives me a sense of Philip very much at my elbow, as it were. You know, all of you, those both who are members of the Catholic Church and those who are not, that the Catholic Church is currently engaged in a global synod. And indeed, you had a very wise and splendid talk about this from Brendan Callahan last year. I want to share a little bit of my own experience so far with the Synod, not simply because it's talking to you about something I have done, or indeed something that's exclusive to religious, though it is largely focused on religious life, but precisely because I think there are so many elements in what I want to talk to you about and present that are relevant to anybody who is trying, as part of a group larger than themselves, a religious family, a family of faith in some way or another, trying to discern where God is calling us, not only as a church, but as a human race at this point in our history. I always find it easier to speak with pictures and illustrations rather than just to kind of garble on. So I'm going to try very hard and see if I can share screen with you. That looks so pretty good so far. Yup. And I therefore, if I can, if I can get this little bit right out of the way, yup, I can then get, oops, no. Sorry, I've got, for reasons unknown to me, I have a very odd little pencil that keeps, so I'm going to just try. Sorry, friends. I don't know why that's right. Mouse is what I want, so let's try this. Come on. Okay, from beginning. Lovely, and I'm just going to click away so as to get you out of the way too. I want to begin with something said in one of his very last addresses to the faithful in El Salvador by St. Oscar Romero. Each one of you, wherever you are, needs to live the life of faith fiercely because you are a true microphone of God our Lord in your context. Thus, the church will always have preaching. I give you a moment to think of what that says to you, to live the life of faith fiercely, because you are a true microphone of God our Lord. And I had the extraordinary privilege this time last year, or in March of last year, as it were, to listen to a microphone from all around the world when I was one of 4 theologians who also happened to be members of religious orders, asked to collate the response to the first stage of the synod from the world's religious. It was an absolutely massive undertaking, quite bonkers really to ask 4 of us to do it, but somehow we managed. This was the group of us who did it. On the left, Sister Maria Simperman, who now works between the Catholic Union in Chicago and the Union of International Superiors General in Rome. She does a very similar job to me as director of the Institute for Consecrated Life in America. She's a Sister of the Sacred Heart. Immediately next to her, José Cristo Rey García Paredes, a Spaniard who is a Claretian missionary, has spent a great deal of his life in India and the Far East, also teaching the theology of religious life in the Philippines. Next to him, Father Arturo Sosa, the General Superior of the Jesuits, who was our very gracious host. He wasn't part of the deliberations. Next to him, also the President of the International Superiors General, the women religious, who also was our hostess, and a wonderful, truly wonderful woman, who is Polish but has spent a great deal of her time out in Latin America. Photoshopped in at the bottom is another Jesuit who from Puerto Rico, Orlando Torres, who on the second day of our 1 week working to gather this massive material together, rang in to say that he thought he was slightly positive for COVID. I did remark that one cannot be slightly positive for COVID any more than one can be slightly pregnant. He then had to spend the whole of our working week with us online because he was languishing in bed, poor man, with COVID. So this was the team who was asked to devise a methodology to look at responses from a huge number of religious. There are 2,000 congregations of women around the world, 200 congregations of men, give or take. We were operating in 6 languages. We were operating right across the continents. And we asked people, first of all, to evoke stories and accounts of synodality as they had themselves experienced it within their religious group, to discover the seeds of synodality that already exist, but using the analogy, the biblical analogy, the seeds and the weeds, also to look at where there were, as it were, weeds choking the seeds of synodality in their experience within the church, to suggest what they might see as God's dream for synodality for the church and the consecrated life in the 3rd millennium and their consequences, and what implications there were for the life and mission of the church. So for me, it was like being in a room with hundreds, thousands of radios all going on at the same time, all talking about different things in a whole series of different languages, and trying to make sense and to try in some way to collate this into something coherent. What really astonished me and my companions was the level of synchronicity, the level of union of experience and of minds and hearts and thinking that there was right across the ages, right across the types of religious orders, right across the continents and the cultures. So that was, I suppose, our biggest surprise. And what we found was that religious were prepared to speak very courageously about situations they see needing change if religious life and the wider church are to survive. There was a very strong critique of where they found kind of anti-synodal practices, as it were, within the church. But the greatest critique really came of themselves. It was a self-critique, but also looking at oppressive attitudes and practices within the wider church and indeed within the wider world. And we were conscious that, a good number of the people answering were people who are trying to live the Christian life in cultural contexts where this is extremely difficult. And so it took a lot of courage for them to raise critical voices when their own position is already so precarious. But what came across also was the zeal and the energy, the signs of hope that these women and men were finding in every human context and corner of the world as they thought about how they might move forward on a synodal path, not only in terms of allowing the Catholic Church globally to flourish, but what enables human beings to flourish as children of God. And they, like many people at the moment involved in the synod, they had a great sense of urgency for action, while knowing that the onus for change truly falls on ourselves, as it were. There was a very powerful sense that the foundation of synodality is baptism, the universal call to holiness and the universal call within the church for all the baptized to share in the threefold gift of Christ as prophet, priest, and kingdom ruler, and sharer of the kingdom, the dream of the kingdom. And in that respect, this is something that, although it was members of religious orders in this instance who were speaking, they were speaking as the baptized. They were speaking as people who are baptized into Christ to share in that threefold ministry. And they saw very much that synodality not only leads to solidarity, but depends for its success on solidarity. Therefore, building up networks with groups collaborating on projects, social projects, spiritual projects, projects of leadership within society, and an overwhelming sense of the awareness that interconnectedness and interdependence of all peoples is what the synod is truly about, strengthening bonds in community with people of goodwill, whether they share the Christian faith or not. A great emphasis was laid, particularly, obviously, given that the ratio of women religious is much greater to the ratio of men. There were very strong inquiries about leadership, about the exercise of power within the church, within religious life, actually within society. There was a sense of appreciation for where this is happening, of a shift in structures and methods of leadership, but also where this isn't happening, a very, very strong call for those shifts in structures and methods, without which they see it impossible for the church to survive and flourish. And what might these shifts be? Well, shifts from problem solving to appreciative inquiry, from leadership as power to servant and transformational leadership. And of course, this isn't only something that's happening within the church. All sorts of organizations are coming to a realization, as we also face the crisis of the abuse of power within the church, but also within politics, within the media, within the world of sport and the arts, a growing realization that we have got to have a different way of looking at and exercising power, if it is to be power that liberates and power that enables, rather than power that crushes. There has been a great appreciation of both congregation, also in group and personal processes, which have learned to be more inclusive. And there was, from different parts of the world, Africa, Indonesia, a reference to the cultural customs among the people, the ordinary people, of ways in which in secular society people are invited to speak, to listen, to be heard, to participate. And above all, the principles of subsidiarity, collegiality, and solidarity in both life and mission are seen as gaining ground in religious life, but also needing to gain ground in the wider church and indeed in wider society. So we didn't really hear anything here that could not relevantly be applied to wider society and to the followers of Christ in general, and indeed to people who have a sense of the spiritual and a desire for that sense of the spiritual to be a process, to be an implement really in allowing society to grow and flourish to the well-being and to the good and benefit of all. The Synod preparatory document originally said, by journeying together and reflecting together on the journey that's been made, the Church will be able to live through her experience, which processes can help her to live communion, achieve participation, and open herself to mission. Whether we think of ourselves as individuals or as members of larger communities, the body of the faithful, these are the 3 steps which we are being asked to take to live communion, to achieve participation, to open ourselves to mission. And it seems to me that there is something not only profoundly gospel-based in all that, but if you are familiar at all with the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, this is precisely where the exercises lead us to live communion with Christ at the deepest possible level, in order to live communion with one another, to not only achieve but offer ourselves in participation. There is no room here, as it were, for passive passengers, and to open ourselves to mission, because that is ultimately always, to every Christian, the call of Christ. What we heard very powerfully, particularly from the religious of the global South and indeed the global East, as well as from the so-called developed world, was a sense of religious increasingly moving out of institutional ministries to a more peripheral stance of being with, being present to, and being alongside. And this is particularly true, I think, for those congregations that find their membership more and more elderly. None of us are getting any younger as we continue in life, but also as there is an increasing call from Pope Francis himself to the peripheries. So an invitation to listen to voices of the impoverished, but also to bring into community conversations those who remain at a distance from the Church or who don't normally participate. And again, the Synod documents asked religious particularly to think of themselves as missionari dell'ascolto, missionaries of listening, whose key verbs are listening, participating, praying, seeking. And that, of course, is something that anyone can do who perhaps find themselves these days a little older, a little more tired, a little less able to be gung-ho. But the power of listening, praying, seeking, and of being present is something that was very, very strongly emphasized and experienced among the religious, who also see themselves, experiencing themselves called to construct communication networks with ecumenical groups, interreligious groups, but also in ministries to marching alongside others in socio-political and economic margins, in support of such people, in support of such movements. Again, this is not a process, as it were, for non-combatants. You know, we're all fighting the good fight, whether we do so by our life of prayer and listening and our goodwill, or whether we are actually able to grab weapons and go out onto the battlefield. So the purpose of this was to allow the Christian community to be seen to be experienced as a credible subject and reliable partner in paths of social dialogue with all people of goodwill. It's a movement outward, but a movement in which we both feel that we have something to offer, but also understand that we have something to receive and something to learn. This included, and it was a very clear call from the religious, a sense that there is a need for lay and religious women and men to be involved in the formation of the priests of the future in order to help emerge a church of all that is more participative and welcoming, and does not see the clergy as some kind of elite who have a particular handle on power, but that this is a church of all the baptized. So where did the religious see seeds of synodality growing in their own experience? Wherever they could hear the cry of the poor, the cry of the earth, survivors of abuse of all sorts. There was an increasingly powerful sense of the need for an eco-theology that recognizes the holiness of all creation. And we heard this very powerfully from the religious who live in parts of the world that are experiencing most toxically the impact of climate change and the impact of a fragile ecological environment. So religious seeing the need for themselves to witness to the ecological dimensions of the evangelical counsels to poverty, chastity, and obedience. Now, all of this was very positive, but there was some extremely robust critiques of the climate of division and polarization that exists wherever the church experiences dogmatism, pride, hypocrisy, envy, jealousy. There were skeptical voices that if people raised a voice in critique, it would be stifled within certain dioceses, certain churches, certain parishes. And there was a very strong sense that wherever we find fundamentalisms, whether theological, moral, social, and even liturgical, then this stifles the seeds of synodality. From North America particularly, there came strong voices about what happens, and also from places like Brazil, when such fundamentalist urges are supported by political, economic, and media groups, and where they are connected with attempts to regain patriarchal power and establish pre-Vatican II models of ecclesial construction. But there was also a very strong voice from the global south of where cultural influences such as the caste system in India, tribalism in Africa, regionalism and nationalism, populist nationalism right across the world, and that included parts of the so-called developed world, were seen as very toxic influences to the growth and development of the church. Sexism, there was a very, very powerful and poignant critique of the issues that beset religious women within the church, seeing themselves in solidarity with other women where they are excluded from meaningful roles in the life of the church. Women religious experiencing themselves as being seen as cheap labor, not receiving adequate support for their ministries and services. Women experiencing themselves as excluded from ecclesial functions, and there were voices speaking from both India and Africa about women religious who were seen as somehow at fault or as less than consecrated if they were not wearing specific religious monastic dress, an inability to understand the fundamental equality and dignity of all the baptized. There was also a very strong voice on behalf of other groups who they perceived as marginalized within the church, divorced and remarried, LGBTQ. It was particularly remarkable that many of these comments came from parts of the world where one would not expect it, from parts of the world where to be gay is itself punishable in civil law, let alone within the church. And a particular sorrow where people find themselves excluded from access to the sacramental and liturgical life of the church. And that was raised as a very particular concern. Where they saw a patriarchal and hierarchical model still prevailing in the theology and practical understanding of ministry, they saw it as embedded in historical, social, and cultural supremacy of the masculine, which, where it prevails, tends to see the clergy as a race apart. There was a particular concern in parts of the world about the emergence of a young, ultra-conservative priesthood not inclined to listen to alternative voices, and where religious experienced and saw the growth of an influence of a toxic clericalism. They saw this as based in deficient initial and ongoing theological and psychosexual formation. And again, it was powerful to hear how much of this came from the voices of Asia and Africa, as well as parts of the global north. So inevitably, questions of leadership arose, and they saw as failures in church leadership when it's focused only on the internal life of the church and not on a church in the midst of the world, when it doesn't listen but only speaks and commands, and when it's governed by the criterion that it's always been done this way. And they saw leadership as failing when it doesn't provide to prepare the lay people for new responsibilities in a church that is changing. I'm particularly struck by this today when the Catholic Church celebrates the feast of the martyrs of Korea. Hundreds of Catholics were martyred in the early days of the church in Korea, but the church came to Korea without priests. The church actually emerged and flourished in Korea without priests. It was an entirely lay church for a significant amount of time. And actually, when eventually priests were sent as missionaries to Korea, they found hundreds of Catholics living a good Catholic life without, of course, the sacraments, but they nevertheless had a life of faith and prayer and witness. So, you know, this is increasingly going to be perhaps the church of the future. And if it is, what are we doing to provide for lay leadership in responsibility? I want to finish with, and perhaps from where you are, you can say in your muted state this prayer together with me. It is indeed the prayer, a prayer that comes from Fratelli Tutti, but is a prayer, I think, for the church of our times. Lord, Father of our human family, you created all human beings equal in dignity. Pour forth into our hearts a fraternal spirit and inspire in us a dream of renewed encounter, dialogue, justice, and peace. Move us to create healthier societies and a more dignified world, a world without hunger, poverty, violence, and war. May our hearts be open to all the peoples and nations of the earth. May we recognize the goodness and beauty that you have sown in each of us, and thus forge bonds of unity, common projects, and shared dreams. Amen. Dear friends, thank you so much for listening to this. I am going to try very hard, if I can, to get back into, or rather out of this. That's good. Screen sharing has stopped, so that I can give you a chance to breathe after that whistle-stop tour and offer you time for thinking, and then time to raise any questions or comments that you may wish to raise.
Thank you, Gemma. That was absolutely a tour de force of, well, I'm sure thousands of pieces of communication from around the world distilled into a mere half hour. If the Synod in Rome next month does even a tenth as well as the four of you appear to have done, then we will be on a good course. But as Gemma said, she's very open to taking a few questions. If anybody has got anything that they want to ask, again, maybe just either raise your hand or wave or put your electronic hand up.
And do feel free to write it in the chat if that would be easier for you equally. And it may not be a question, it may simply be a comment, and you're very, very welcome to make any that you feel. I may also have stunned you all into total silence, but it would be nice to have somebody brave enough to raise. Madge, I think I see a hand. Hello, Madge, fire away. You're going to need to unmute yourself. Madge, you're muted. You're trying to unmute.
Yes.
Yay!
That's all right now. Yes, I'm properly speaking Louisa Poole, not Madge, but so people know me more as Louisa. That's just a name. The question I'm asking is, as you were speaking, it came to me that so much of these things are actually explicit in Vatican II and the Church in the modern world, and all of that was back then an excitement to everybody is still, and it fell asleep, of course, for quite a long time. But people who were at that time involved in the Vatican Council or who were interested in teaching about it, etc., so later on, would find the Synod absolutely wonderful, and a sense of saying, well, it's about time, that all these things came forward. And wonderful that Pope Francis was inspired to find the one method of bringing it forward that is irrefutable, because if it comes from ordinary people all over the world, nobody can say it's a clique somewhere have brought it forward. All these suggestions that you've so well outlined for us. And thank you very much, Gemma. Excellent. And I will be looking forward to going back on it again and just updating myself on the threads that you've opened up that go in different directions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madge. There's a comment in chat about whether I meant South Korea when I was talking about Korea. I'm not sure that at the time of the Korean martyrs, Korea had been divided into North and South. So I think that was a historical moment where I suspect Korea was kind of more united then than it is now. But to pick up on something, if I may, that Madge was saying, I had the immense privilege, I have to say, it's probably one of the scariest gigs I've ever had. The day before yesterday, I went to Oxford to give a retreat to 100 Anglican bishops all in one go. Oh my days, that was really something. They are actually, a very, very warm and extremely welcoming group and lovely people, but it was still fairly scary. And one of the things I did was actually take one or two bits from the synod. And, you know, what came across from them very powerfully, both from Archbishop Justin and the rest of the bishops, was that, you know, this is as relevant to the Anglican Church as it is to the Catholic Church. And indeed, you know, whenever I've spoken about the synod in other groups, other ecclesial groups, you know, there's been a real sense of engagement and excitement, because there seems to be a sense that God is calling all people of faith and all people of goodwill to try to move towards, you know, listening more profoundly, listening to one another, and very particularly, you know, listening to what the Spirit is saying to us out there in the world. You know, it's as if there is a very particular kairos, a very particular time has come upon us where, you know, we have no other choice if we are to survive. And there is a very particular sense of our being called, I think, to listen to the cry of the suffering world, and to the cry of suffering within our own faith communities, let alone anywhere else. Joanna Hale saying, fascinating how similar themes resonated. Yes, I mean, Joanna, that was quite extraordinary. And, you know, because we were working under such pressure of time, we didn't have time to kind of sit and try and work out who we were listening to. We were just, you know, reading all this massive information, but every congregation had a code number. So every once in a while we'd think, blimey, who's saying this? And we'd look it up, you know. And sometimes you could sense it was a voice from Asia or Africa or, you know, some particular part of the world. Sometimes you could tell that it was women religious speaking or that it was particularly men. But, you know, time and time again, we got, you know, blindsided by the synchronicity of the voices, you know, around the world. And that was really something. It really did, gosh, it was an extraordinary privilege, but an extraordinary experience to hear so many voices so clearly. A great privilege, really. And kind of heartening to think there are lots of people out there, you know, really going for it. And not afraid to speak out when they found things difficult. So, you know, maybe a question to all of you is, you know, from all of that, what challenge do you go away with tonight? You know, in what sense, if any, is there a call, an invitation, a challenge to you from what you've heard? Because this is a global voice, you know, it's a voice, it's not them, it's us.
I think, did Charles just have his hand up there?
Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
I'm
very
Charles
well.
or Carmel Pace. I graduated in 1967. I heard today an interview with Cardinal Grech, and the interviewer asked him, are you going to decide about sort of doctrinal things like divorce and remarried couples and LGBT? And Cardinal Grech said no, but he said we're going to become more spiritual. And listening to you, Gemma, it sounds as if, I said that's very vague, but it says everything and it says nothing at the same time. And this strikes me very much, that sort of letting people pray and letting people reflect and letting people discern. All of them want a more lively church, a more responsive church. And he said, you know what the agenda is? The agenda is the gospel. And it was written by Jesus. As I told you, I thought it was too vague, sort of amateurish. But the more I reflected about it, the more it felt it makes a lot of sense.
Well, I think I would agree with you, Charles. I mean, I think very wisely, Cardinal Grech is attempting not to make himself a hostage to fortune, you know, by promising things on which he can't necessarily deliver. But I do think this, we know that in all of his teaching, Pope Francis has been consistent in promoting what he calls a culture of encounter. And when we truly encounter someone who is other, we cannot help but change. We are changed by the encounter. And, you know, in the Gospels, people were changed because they met Jesus. But Jesus was also, in a sense, changed when he met people. You know, the Syrophoenician woman, he had to kind of, you know, think again about just being a Messiah for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. You know, people changed him by the demands they made on him, or by what they shared of their own anguish with him. And so it seems to me, in a truly Ignatian fashion, that we don't go into this with a preset agenda, but if we are truly engaged in listening, truly prepared to listen, truly prepared to be present and to encounter, then we will be the change that we want to see, because the church will change. You know, we can't un-encounter someone once we have encountered them. Now, that may not be fast enough for people who want, you know, snappy answers and quick agendas. And there are certainly things that I would really like to see before I die within the church. And for any of you interested in the particular question of women and diaconia, we have one of the foremost experts on this question, Phyllis Zagano, who was on the Pope's commission looking into that question, coming to give a splendid speak at a splendid conference that is being run in Cambridge in November on that very issue. So by the Margaret Beaufort Institute, where I now work. So I will send information about that to Simon in the hope that he might send that out to the rest of you. We would love to see, I would love to see some of my old Heathrop students and colleagues there at that. But, you know, the big change, I think, has to be the change of listening, the change of encounter, if that's to be a genuine change. And then, you know, we will find that as a church, as a family, as a group, there will be a dynamic change on our part. That is what I hope and pray for. We can't wait for Daddy to fix it. You know, it's not up to Daddy to fix it. We've got to be the fix ourselves. But first of all, we've got to learn what truly needs fixing. I hope that wasn't vague in the line of Cardinal Grech, Charles.
No, I think it was wise in the same way as Cardinal Grech.
Yeah. I think I've possibly exhausted everybody to... I'm just... Paul,
I think there's
Paul,
one
I'm
thing.
really enjoying your cat. Please don't chase it away. So sorry, I interrupted.
Marie Quayle, I think.
Yeah, I'm just unmuting myself.
Oh, Mary, hello. How lovely to see you.
Yeah, and you too, Gemma. Good while since.
Indeed.
I was thinking Pope Francis, in a way, started two enormous movements at more or less the same time. The one of synodality that you're focusing on, and the other one of the Laudato Si program about the common home.
Yeah.
And he's about to produce a follow-up to that, I think, isn't he, in
Yes.
October?
Yeah.
And he's introducing the huge questions about what we are doing to our common home and our responsibility, and things like the challenging the technocratic paradigm and the throwaway culture, and how we are with other people. And I'm wondering, Gemma, whether you find the two, in your work on synodality, whether you found the Laudato Si program sort of there, present, or whether it was somehow seen as something quite separate. And
no, absolutely not. And on the contrary, particularly, Mary, I think you will appreciate this as a religious yourself, that there was a very strong call for what they called, an eco-theology of the vows, for religious to see and to experience and live the vows of consecrated life as something that was profoundly connected with eco-theology, rather than as something that was kind of lived in a kind of consecrated separate room, which has nothing to do with this. And very particularly, I think the religious from the global south, which is suffering so much more the impact of climate change and climate disaster, saw this as absolutely essential, and saw that if religious life, and indeed Christian life, does not witness clearly to the rest of the world a commitment to our common home, then it's only being lived partially. We can't live it in a sort of sacred box, as if it has nothing to do with the material world. And I mean, I find your comment particularly apposite and particularly poignant when our present government, in its wisdom, has just announced that it's going to, back down on a number of its climate commitments. Yeah. I mean, what the heck is that?
Yeah.
I think Pope Francis might have a thing or two to say to the present government on that, on the wisdom or otherwise of that particular notion.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So, I would want to see a sacramental theology that enables us to see a kind of deeper sense of ecological solidarity as being part of the gift of the sacraments. I think, just as I think one cannot now, one could not possibly do a Eucharistic theology without being conscious of things like racism or toxic nationalism or tribalism, or as being essentially inimical to Eucharistic theology. We would have to bring those kinds of reflections into our understanding of what it means to us to be one in Christ. It seems to me that it would be very difficult now to do Eucharistic theology, baptismal theology, without having a profound understanding of the connection of the sacraments to ecology. It would be extraordinarily partial. And I suppose one of my own senses, and it's been a growing sense in the last however many years, is that we need to move out of a notion of the sacraments as a sort of holy fetish.
Right.
Because I think there is a tendency to do that, and to think of them as something much more holistic that connects us far more, both socially and ecologically, with the community of creation. So I think that, and there were certainly echoes of that within the response of the religious to the synod, and I think there are very strong echoes in the continental synod documents. If you've not read them, they really are worth reading. I'm prejudiced, but I would particularly say the one from Latin America is really, really worth reading.
Are there any more thoughts?
Do you think we're talked out?
Well, oh no, Michael is waving a pen at the bottom.
Hi, Michael.
Hello, Gemma. Great to hear you again on this subject. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, it's a bit déjà vu for you
No,
since I
no,
came
it's
to Ireland today.
repetition at its best. Thank you very much indeed. I just throw a little googly at the end here. But, there's a concern here in Ireland, and I don't know whether it's the same in other parts of the world, but the degree of involvement and participation in the synodal process is at best patchy. And to what extent, and I know we're told it's not a democratic process and so on, so it's not a majoritarian kind of process. But is there a danger that the validity of the voices might be undermined? People could say, well, only a tiny minority actually got involved in this in the first place anyway. How do we respond to that kind of objection, do you think?
You know, I think we just have to have the conversations in any way that we can.
Yeah.
I mean, Michael, you know that before I became a theologian, I was a linguist, and I indeed work as a simultaneous translator. And the great art of simultaneous translation is to try and find words that the people you're with can understand. They may not be the same words as you yourself would normally use, but you're trying to find a way to communicate. And, you know, I've had some really interesting discussions about, you know, what the synod is really about with people who never darken the doors of a church, you know? Or people who are not Catholics at all, but who still, you know, once you pitch in and you get a way to open up a conversation, you know, they've got plenty to say. You know, I think we've got to be very broad in how we try to elicit participation. And that, of course, is going to include people who are very angry. And I think part of it is, are we prepared to listen to that? But it also, it seems to me, you know, people will have to make their own minds up. And already, let's face it, if people are not finding nourishment for their spirit and nourishment for their soul in their particular parish, well, they tend to go elsewhere. They're doing that already. And, you know, I think what we will find is that the moribund parts of the church may well die, and they probably deserve to. And where, you know, where there is a bit of faith, hope, and love alive, it will flourish. And we may find that in unexpected places. I'm not prepared to throw in the towel yet, Michael.
No, it's not about throwing the towel, but it's just answering a possible objection.
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, the fact is, and I would say that to anybody who then says, well, you know, it didn't represent me. Well, you know, if you're not prepared to dance, you're not going to be able to come to the party, friends, you know. At the end of the day, I don't think Pope Francis could have said any more strongly that all voices are welcome.
Yeah. Well, I think I would just take up what you said earlier on. This is the only game in town.
It's the only game in town. Yeah,
it really is. Or else collapse. But I could just see there's a possible weakness from people who might. Well, this is just
But you know, Michael, just a thought occurs to me. I've a colleague at the Margaret Beaufort who has specialization is the kind of theology and spirituality of children. And she was asked in her own local parish if she would do something on the synod. And she said yes, as long as she was allowed to start with the children. And she got a whole bunch of kids together, school age, you know, young children, and said to them, these were primary school age, you know, what's it like for you going to church? And, you know, no big surprise when they said, it's boring. So she said, well, can you tell me why it's boring? And they said, because we can't see. We want to see what Father's doing, and we can't because there are too many grown-ups in the way, you know. And it's not exactly rocket science, but nobody had ever asked the children, can you see what's going on? And are you interested in what's going on? And if you are, can we make some better provision to make sure that you do participate and you do see? And I think sometimes we're a bit like this with people maybe whose participation isn't great. We don't ask them the obvious questions like, you know, what would help you to feel you could participate? So maybe that's a challenge to us also. If we want people to come, well, let's find ways of enabling that, you know?
Absolutely.
Amen.
Amen. Hallelujah. Someone say amen.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Gemma. Thank you for that question, Michael. That sounds like that might be a good note upon which to finish then. And it's been a really stimulating evening. Thank you very much indeed, Gemma, for the input that you've given to us, for the insight that you've given to us, and for the very timely nature of that. As you said, we had some similar input about a similar theme about the synod this time last year, but I think with the actual gathering, the first of the two gatherings in Rome happening in just a couple of weeks' time, it's very apposite for us to have that little behind the scenes tour, as it were, so that when we begin to hear some of the deliberations and when we get some of the news coverage and so on, I think we'll all feel perhaps a little bit more connected to some of the inner workings of that, and perhaps also be reassured that it's a good process in good hands if you and your colleagues have had such a steer on this particular part of it. So thank you on behalf of the whole church for the work that you've done in that sense, and thank you very much on behalf of all of us here this evening, and indeed those others who have expressed a desire to have been here if they could but haven't been able to be, and who are looking forward to the videoing and watching back of it in the days and weeks ahead. So thank you to everybody for giving up your time this evening. Thank you for your support of the Heathrop Association. Thank you in particular to my fellow trustees and committee members. And please God, in the next few weeks, we will have a little programme of upcoming Heathrop events to stimulate you, and also no doubt some very exciting news from Rome and from the Synod, a little foretaste of which we've had from Jenna this evening. So good night and God bless.